Hello, welcome everyone. We're going to give it a minute as people come into the room, the virtual room. Appreciate you all joining us today. Welcome, folks. We're going to give it another minute or so as people filter in. Okay, are my panelists ready to get going? Excellent. Hello, everyone. My name is Becca Wolf. I am Senior Advocacy Strategist for the American Immigration Council, and I'm here to moderate our wonderful panel of American Immigration Council staff who went on a couple of different trips to the border in the last couple of months. I'm not going to do a large introduction because we really want to get to the substance of this panel, which is to give you all some insight into what is happening on the border, what our staff has seen, and also sort of some takeaways of what we think we are need to be advocating for on policy positions moving forward, particularly as we turn into 2024 and an election year. A couple of just technical things. We are going to have a question and answer session at the end. Please put your questions for question and answer into the Q&A box at the bottom of the Zoom screen. We are not going to be monitoring the chat, so there are two different places. The Q&A is the one that we're going to be able to see, and we will collect those questions, as many as we can answer, and address them at the end. Also, we are recording this, and there is a live stream that is happening, just so you all know, and we can make the recording available after the fact. And with that, I will introduce our three panelists. First, we're going to have Dara Lind. Dara is a senior fellow. She's based in Washington, D.C. She brings her extensive expertise as a highly regarded immigration reporter to the council, where she now focuses on policy analysis and public engagement. She joined the council staff's trip to El Paso and Juarez in October, where staff met with asylum seekers and service providers on both sides of the border. Then we'll have Adriel Orozco. Adriel is our senior policy counsel and based in North Carolina. His focus is on policy related to immigration courts and due process in the immigration system. He went on a trip with the Immigration Hub to San Diego and Tijuana in coordination with and volunteering with the Haitian Bridge Alliance. And finally, we're going to have Juan Aviles. He is the policy associate for the council's state and local team, and he's also based in North Carolina. And he was part of the trip to El Paso and Juarez with council staff, where he focused on the local government's response to new arrivals and the issues at the border. So welcome, fantastic panelists. Really happy to have you here. We're going to start with you, Dara. I think our first question is really to have you kind of walk us through what kinds of difficulties people are experiencing on their way to the border, and when they're being processed as they're attempting to come across the border from Mexico into the United States, particularly while using the CBP-1 app.
Sure. So just to to kind of offer a little bit of background about who we talked to on this trip, because while I think we have on this call or on this webinar like good amount of expertise kind of through the process, what we did and what Adriel did in San Diego and Tijuana kind of complement each other. For our trip to El Paso and Juarez, which was coordinated and managed by one Rebecca Wolf, we interviewed asylum seekers who were waiting to cross, waiting for CBP-1 app appointments on the Juarez side of the border, just to kind of give people like a quick clarification about what border policy currently is. After the end of Title 42 this spring, the Biden administration created, through a series of new policy proposals, a system where if you want to go through the like normal asylum process as it previously existed, you would have to arrive at a port of entry with an appointment set up through the CBP-1 app, which has allowed for over 1,000, I think, like a lot over 1,000 at this point, appointments per day across the border, but which is still not anywhere near the level of actual demand. So in practice, people are trying on a daily basis to get CBP-1 app appointments for a few weeks out, and if they can't get it that day, trying again the next day. So it's not clear until you have an appointment how long you'll be waiting. And so many of the people we spoke to had been waiting for weeks, months, still didn't have appointments. Before they even got to Juarez, they had almost invariably been harassed at best or robbed at worst by Mexican officials or people wearing official uniforms, often had had to deal with organized crime on the way there, had found themselves getting to Juarez at a state where both they didn't have much in the way of financial resources and of course needed to stay and live there for a certain period of time, and with very little faith in a justified lack of faith that the Mexican government could protect them. That's been reinforced for many of them by the fact that even though US law continues to say that asylum seekers have a right to, present themselves at ports of entry and seek asylum there, that the US has continued a policy that it's engaged in various ways for the last several years of restricting access at those ports of entry. The current way that this works is that people without CBP-1 appointments are often stopped before they arrive in the US, often by Mexican officials. And when we ask people if they even tried to approach the port, because they felt that they were in danger or absolutely needed to get out of Juarez, they said, no, of course not, because we know that Mexican officials would stop us or would arrest us or would sweep through and clear us away if we even tried that, which suggests that despite what the US government says, it in practice is preventing people from getting to ports of entry. And even though, its policy is that you should not be subject to a higher bar for screening if you couldn't access the CBP-1 app for technical reasons, or if you're in real dire straits, that people who are in those conditions can't even get to the port of entry and present themselves in practice. This was reinforced by the fact that we spoke to at least a couple of cases in which people can't use the CBP-1 app because they do not speak any of the three languages in which it's currently available, which are Spanish, English, and Haitian Creole. This is supposed to be a reason that people should not have to use the CBP-1 app, but in practice, there was no way for them to get through at the port of entry or even into the US. What we saw were a bunch of people who really, really wanted to come the right way. They didn't necessarily know what the asylum process was. They didn't have any understanding of the Biden administration's new regulations that are supposed to really incentivize people to use the CBP-1 app by raising the screening standard for people who cross between ports of entry. No one we interviewed had any idea that that rule existed. That was not what was motivating them to use the CBP-1 app and wait. They just really wanted to come the right way. And they thought that this was a way that would allow them to get into the US and live and work legally for at least a certain period of time. And so that's what they were waiting for. But they were waiting in a situation where they didn't feel safe and didn't necessarily feel that they could sustain it for as long as they were being asked to.
Thank you so much, Dara. And I think you're starting to lay out the difficulties that people are experiencing on their way to our border, even before they actually cross. And of course, we're going to hear more from our other panelists on the experience once they are crossing and beyond. But first, just to go back to what you sort of started to talk about there, how are people getting their information when they are in Mexico or in their home countries? On their planning their way to the border, and as you mentioned, there's these policies that the Biden administration has been relying on to sort of say that will act as a deterrent, or somehow people will self-screen, but that of course only goes so far if people are not actually getting that information. So how are people getting information, and what does that look like?
There's a lot of word of mouth and a lot of social media. And both of those are consistent with what we've seen in the past, right? Word of mouth is really, really powerful. If you know someone who has been able to get to the US and is able to work, that person will then let people know that they were able to succeed. And so that even if other people in your social network have tried and have failed, knowing that one person has succeeded, we were hearing pretty consistently, makes people feel that they can succeed as well. That often means that people have an understanding that the person who they know in the US might have a place for them, that they can stay while they're living in the US, which may or may not pan out, but it gives them kind of an anchor to hold on to and a place where they think they can go in those cases. Not everyone does know someone. And when people don't know anyone, that's when you really start to see, like, people will mention TikTok, they'll mention WhatsApp. There's a lot of social media information floating around, very little of which is validated by anything other than people's personal experience, and some of which is outright misinformation or disinformation. That's totally consistent with what we've seen in the past. TikTok as a platform is like very, very popular in a way. Obviously, it wasn't a couple of years ago, but a few years ago, we were still kind of hearing this sort of thing, just in terms of people hearing media reports or Facebook or that kind of thing. It's really hard to get accurate information. And frankly, there's also a sense that if people are receiving mixed messages, they really want to believe that they can make a better life for themselves. They want to believe that they can find a place where they can be safe. And so even people who acknowledged that they'd heard mixed messages about the difficulty still said that they had confidence that it was going to be easier for them than it in fact was.
Yeah, and that goes to sort of our follow-up question here, which is how does this affect their asylum cases down the road when they are sort of starting off from a point of misinformation?
That is a really good question. I mentioned before that people who are waiting for the CBP1 app are waiting because they think of it as the right way to come. Some of those people are think of it, have really robust asylum cases. They are aware that asylum is a way to get protection against persecution in your home country. They have been targeted. They were former government officials who were targeted by organized crime. They were people who, were like political dissidents in Venezuela. That absolutely exists. There are also, frankly, people who don't necessarily have a strong understanding of what asylum is, but if asked, would in fact be able to articulate something that would in fact be grounds for an asylum claim. It's just that they're not thinking in those terms. And then there are people who, frankly, don't necessarily have claims for humanitarian protection, who are waiting for CBP1, who don't necessarily understand that the point of it is supposed to be to start an asylum application. They just think of it as a way to get a work permit. And that means that because the US government, which has done so much to promote the use of this app, has not done as much to promote what the app is supposed to be used for, is setting itself up for a situation in which some of these people are not going to be able to make strong asylum claims and are going to end up getting ordered removed from the US, who might not have understood that that was going to be the end result.
Thanks, Sarah. And I just want to ask you to put a finer point on this. How do migrants find out about CBP1 in the first place? I know you sort of said that, but it's a question that's already popped up a couple of times in our Q&A, and I know that this is really the part of the heart of what you're going to.
It's really remarkable how widely word about CBP1 has spread. We actually talked to one couple who deliberately came to Mexico because they knew that you could use CBP-1 in northern Mexico to get an appointment in the US, that they had not originally been planning to come up that way. But once they heard about it, they said, let's get ourselves to somewhere where, because it's supposed to be usable in northern Mexico and geofenced so that you can't use it like before that. So they got themselves into the geofencing area. There are also people who will hear about it from, from shelters, from people they're traveling with, from smugglers early in the use of the widespread use of the app this year. There were anecdotes about smugglers using cell phones and charging people for like, oh, you can use this to make a CBP-1 appointment. It's a special CBP-1 phone. Because in general, people who are trying to make money along the migrant route will absolutely use any information available to them and twist it in a way that's going to make them money. So, the US government has done a certain amount to like promote the use of CBP-1 as the right way to come. And so that has really reinforced all of this other social media messaging. But it's led to a situation in which the relationship between CBP-1 and like an actual immigration process in the United States is just not a connection that people are drawing.
Thank you, Dara. So we're going to turn now to Adriel. Adriel, you went on a different trip. You were in the San Diego and Tijuana area. I know that you're going to speak a little bit about the experiences that folks have when they're crossing, but can you talk a little bit about what kind of choices they are making when deciding how to cross, whether they can use CBP-1, et cetera?
Yes, of course. Thanks, Becca. Yeah, so I was in San Diego. I was at the Migrant Welcome Center, which opened in October with funding from the County of San Diego. That was really spurred starting in September when CBP started releasing migrants representing themselves at the border and being processed into different transit centers around the county. And so finally, there was some funding from the county invested into being able to process individuals. And so the folks that mostly that I met had entered without inspection. They had entered into areas that weren't designated for entry. And that's primarily because of the situation where folks were like families or children or other folks with vulnerabilities were being sent to a different area. And so I really only got to see the makeup of one population there. But San Diego itself, the port of entry has 350 of the 1,450 overall CBP-1 appointments. So I spoke to two individuals who were at the Welcome Center who one had been waiting for 4 months. That person was from the Middle East. Had left because of their sexual orientation and had been waiting in Mexico for 4 months for the CBP-1 appointment and could no longer wait there. There was another person from Honduras that I met who had been waiting for 2 months, who had run out of money to stay in Mexico. And so they had heard of an alternative way of getting into the United States and were able to make their way in an area not designated for entry. And so what we see is that folks have to make different choices. Folks want to be able to, like Dara said, enter quote unquote the right way of how they learn to do it. I mean, some folks that I spoke to also didn't even know about CBP-1. So I think we're just seeing that there's a lot of difference in information that people know, a lot of different access to networks that they have. And so I think that's really what's influencing people when they're presenting to themselves at the border. When I spoke to people, they were just looking for safety. They were looking for stability and see the United States as a place for that. And so that's primarily why I heard people were trying to make their way more here.
Thank you. And can you talk a little bit about the effects of those different choices? Some folks are interested in what does it mean when you enter via CBP-1 in terms of your sort of position for future benefits versus when people are entering outside of those appointments?
Yeah, well, I will tell you that I sat down with somebody for about an hour trying to explain to them the entire complicated process that they found themselves in. The information that they were able to glean from Border Patrol was that they had an immigration hearing, that they had to go to it. And this individual, the person from Honduras, had to wait until 2026 to the hearing. And I told him, do not wait until 2026 for you to act on your case. There's so many things you need to do before then. And so I think part of it was being able to explain, well, first I asked if he knew what it meant that he had entered without inspection. What would that mean for his case? He said, no, nobody's explained it to me. And so I had to explain to him that, well, getting an attorney is super important. As we know, there are, I think, like more than 60% of people from EOIR's own statistics, or the immigration court's own statistics, have to navigate the complicated immigration court process without an attorney. And so I explained that eventually he would have to present his asylum case. And eventually there would have to be a determination as to whether or not he would actually be able to qualify for asylum or have to seek other types of protection. And so I think that's the difficulty, is that folks are sort of finding themselves in this sort of uncertain situation where years down the road, we don't know what policy is going to look like in 2026. And so, the law that applies to them now might look very differently based on really what's happening at the executive level. And so I think it just becomes very complex for individuals who are coming to the United States, trying to understand how is it that they actually can get safety and security in this country. What restrictionist policy is going to come out of which Republican or Democratic government at that moment in time. And so I think that was sort of the learning that I got from speaking to this person, is that, I can spend as much time reading and trying to learn about these policies, but really the way that they impact people are just so at times nebulous, given just the backlogs in the immigration system and trying to understand how those are navigated.
Yeah, and that goes, sort of perfectly into the next question, Adriel, which is what kinds of legal services and other kinds of services do people have once they cross the border, and what are the obstacles to those?
Yeah, so one interesting thing that I learned in speaking to other folks, or there were a group of Somalis who had fled their country, very succinctly, they just told me there's no government there, there's no protection for them, and so there was no choice to stay. And they had no connections in the United States, no friends, no networks here, and they were told by Border Patrol officers to go to New York. And so they were pretty dead set that that's where they were going to go. Unfortunately, they didn't have any resources to get there, and they were pretty worried about how they were going to get there. And so, unfortunately, even with county resources, there are enough resources to be able to help folks who don't have money to be, or who spent all their money trying to get to the United States and their journey, and then now here finding themselves not even knowing if they can leave this welcome center and going somewhere else. And that's related to services, because I think it really depends on people's destination cities. But as we know, folks who are seeking asylum, a lot of them spend a lot of their money to get to the United States, and so they don't have resources to be able to hire private attorneys. And so there just really aren't that many resources for people to actually get representation through this process. And so, as folks might know, people do have a right to an attorney in immigration court, but at no expense to the federal government. And so that's why you have such high numbers of individuals who have to navigate that complex process alone. And so the CBP does provide a sheet of service providers in the area that they go to. Unfortunately, either those phone numbers might be old, depending on how long it's been that they've actually updated that. Nonprofit service providers are actually supposed to update that information with the agency that's in charge of that often, but CBP sometimes doesn't quickly update the information they're providing. So that can also be a problem. And some other individuals, some of the issues that they were experiencing was that they were deciding to go to different destination cities, or I actually spoke to one person who was like, I don't even know why CBP put that address on my paperwork. I don't even know what address that is. And so then I had to sort of explain to him, like, okay, well, when you get to this other city that you were actually planning to go to, find an attorney. You need to change that address, because if you don't go to immigration court, there's huge implications. You can be ordered deported in absentia. And so there's huge consequences for folks in some of in their decision making and the actions that they do or do not take. And so Yeah, the dearth of legal services really is a huge problem for folks who are having to navigate one of not just complex, but also ever-changing immigration laws.
Thanks, Adriel. And I don't know if you have covered all that you wanted to say about it, but can you talk a little bit about so now that you mentioned that people are sort of the way that some people are choosing in quotation marks where to end up in the United States, that is having these sort of ripple effects on other communities. Can you talk a little bit more about what that looks like? And then we're also, of course, going to bring in Juan from our state and local team to talk about the responses of those state and local governments. But why is that happening? And is that different now than it used to be? Why does it seem like there is such a change in where people are going and how they're deciding to get there?
Yeah, I think, well, for one, even thinking about San Diego, they have a really strong network of immigrant serving organizations that actually started really forming because of the Trump administration. So folks who are being released on the streets in San Diego started really in 2018, and there was this strong shelter system that was created. And so I think the great thing was that there was existing infrastructure already created by civil society. I think, unfortunately, what I saw in San Diego is that there was sort of a disconnect from the funding that was being given by the county itself, and actually trying to connect to that existing infrastructure instead of funding other organizations that weren't part of that structure. And I think that sort of goes to, as well as to other cities across the country. So I think in a lot of ways, people are going to larger cities because those are the ones people are hearing about by word of mouth. That's where people, I think folks are also moving less from rural areas and more from urban areas in their home country. So they're looking for bigger, larger cities as well. And so I think some of the challenges that we're seeing, at least from my perspective in cities like Chicago and New York, is that there really isn't, they weren't really prepared to have a coordinated strategy around how to help migrants who had really no networks, which is also what we've seen in the past, is that people tended to have stronger networks in the United States. And I also, on the trip, I also saw that there was really vastly different experiences between migrants who had more wealth. So folks who still could pay for their transportation when they were in the United States versus other folks who had just really spent all their savings to get here. And so I think that also impacts the way that other communities across the country have been able to respond, whether or not people are able to actually depend on their family members or their friends to be able to find stability. And I think that those are some of the differences that I saw as folks are, at least for the folks that I was speaking to briefly at the Migrant Center.
Adriel, can you just clarify the difference between those folks being advised or getting some information about choosing to go to a big city even when they don't have context there versus some of the media reporting that we've seen in the last year of Texas or Florida or some states putting people on buses and sending them places? Can you just explain a little bit of the difference there? Because I think a lot of people don't know that those are two different things happening.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, so there are sort of governors who are using this as an opportunity for politics, right? And so there are governors who, like the Texas governor, previously the Arizona governor, being able to send folks to cities that they determine themselves to be like sanctuary cities or welcoming cities for migrants and really trying to overwhelm them. And so we saw also in Florida, folks being sent to Massachusetts, migrants being sent to Massachusetts without an idea of where they were going to go. And really the purpose there is to overwhelm, to create media hits. But the migrants don't know where they're going, what the purpose is of getting to those destinations. Versus the difference when you're like at the Migrant Welcome Center, part of it was really trying to triage and help people know where they were going to go. And so cities like San Diego or Denver. I know that the city of Chicago is also trying to help folks with transportation, is that it's actually trying to make sure folks get the support that they need so they can continue on to their journey of where they're going to be temporarily as they're trying to go through their immigration process. And so, some folks say, oh, well, any transportation is helpful. And that could be potentially true, but only if the person's actually going to stay and live there, right? And so people shouldn't really use as political footballs, just to make points. And so I think that's really the difference, is that we want people to continue on in their journeys and to have support where they go, but not necessarily be sent somewhere and then forgotten. Just for personal or political purposes.
Thanks very much, Adriel. So bringing in Juan from our state and local team, a fairly unique setup in national immigration policy organization. So really, really proud and excited about the work that you do. Can you explain a little bit about what this state and local team does, Juan?
Sure. So the state and local team was established nearly a decade ago due to a real desire from state and local leaders to be more proactive in approaching immigration within their own communities. And this was especially in the face of federal inaction. So now we work in more than 100 communities in every region of the country. So from Portland, Maine to San Diego, California, and really everywhere in between. Our state and locals team work leverages really original research to support three main pillars. So local level work with municipal, community, and civic leaders, state level work with governor's offices, statewide departments, they're taking part in state legislative advocacy, like in-state tuition, for example, and business community support as well through chambers of commerce and business coalitions. Some examples of the specific programs that we support are the Offices of New American State Network, Gateways for Growth, the Global Challenge Chamber Network, and you can read a lot more about these on the council's website. So in our state and local work, as I said previously, we use original research to really quantify exactly how immigrants contribute at every level of our economy and in every community. And then we use this narrative to bring together leadership across industries, across the political aisle, and across cities and states to really advocate for and implement policies that work to integrate immigrants into the US. So tying this back into this conversation, given the recent influx of migrants into states and localities, the importance of our work really has grown and the need and demand for solutions has as well.
Awesome. It's so great. And I know that there's already even a fair number of questions in our Q&A. So your perspective on the local response is particularly desired in this conversation. So can you talk about that? A lot of the coverage of this issue in general has been focused on, a city here or a city there, but can you talk about how states as a whole are responding?
Of course. So as you just mentioned, the conversation around newly arrived migrants, it really has centered on localities and the efforts going on at the local level. And this is by necessity because local on-the-ground efforts focus on immediate needs and providing direct services to those newly arrived migrants. But at the same time, state governments have a really important role to play that is additive to the local efforts. Some examples of this include convening various stakeholders, including city and county governments, federal partners, nonprofits, employers, the legal community, and funders to ensure there's a coordinated response. State governments can leverage state funds to add more capacity. They can marshal resources to increase access to legal services and work authorization. And giving these efforts, state governments, they're really at the center of the apparatus that supports welcoming and integration of newly arrived migrants. Just also important to note that efforts to support these newly arrived migrants are in the interior are occurring at all levels of government. So as I just mentioned, from local governments taking action to shelter migrants, to state offices of New Americans leading on integration efforts, to nonprofits working on the ground and providing services to those newly arrived migrants. So these efforts are really to welcome migrants are really occurring across all levels of government. And I can talk a little bit about state offices of new Americans. So states with offices of new Americans are the most engaged in their responses to welcoming new arrivals. So an Office of New Americans, which is abbreviated to ONA, can serve as a direct service provider and or give technical assistance and guidance to relevant state agencies on how to meet the needs of diverse new American populations. These offices and their directors also provide advice, direction to the governor and relevant state agencies, and they are generally responsible for implementing any sort of statewide immigrant integration initiative. As of now, there are currently 19 ONAs across the country. So this includes in some of the most impacted states by where migrants are going to the most, like New York, Illinois, California, Colorado, and Massachusetts. All of these ONAs participate in the bipartisan ONA State Network, which is convened by the American Immigration Council and West Global Talent Bridge, where they can share best practices in their efforts to welcome new arrivals and troubleshoot common challenges in real time. So while the ONA network focuses on a variety of policy issues and areas, welcoming new arrivals is an effort that each of these offices really has had a hand in. So going in a little bit more specific here, ONAs, like many of the other groups across the country who are responding to newly arrived migrants, are encountering hurdles in their responses. So access to legal services for migrants, challenges to obtaining work authorization, and difficulties in finding shelter are among the most prevalent problems. As discussed by others on this panel, many of the issues stem directly from inconsistencies and negligence during migrant processing at the border. So for example, in El Paso, the vast majority of migrants that we spoke to were unaware of what and how to retrieve their I-94, which is a document that, among many other things, is really crucial to applying for work authorization. So if you couple this with challenges that newly arrived migrants are facing and already accessing legal services, this really creates a bottleneck in migrant resettlement that states then have to expend already scarce resources and coordinated responses to. In particular, I would say that the problem of work authorization access really demonstrates a clear need for a multi-sector response. And so as such, I will add here that there is a role for the business community to play as well, both in the response and advocacy necessary to resolve this problem. As we all know, labor shortages are continuing across the country, and businesses may see asylum seekers arriving, and many of those asylum seekers are looking for work as a population that can help address the need for labor across industries in the country. So in November, I will say here that the council led more than 100 business leaders, including the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, in signing a letter that called on Congress to speed up work authorization processes to 30 days as opposed to the current 180 days that it takes. So really, in short, state governments act as conveners of partners and provider of resources to localities responding to newly arrived migrants, and states with offices of new Americans really are uniquely positioned to support in welcoming and integrating new arrivals.
Absolutely, Juan. And you answered a lot of the questions that were in the Q&A there. People, as you know very well, people are really interested in this issue of work permits, the issue of what happens when they get to these states and why there's such confusion. So you really identified some of those ways. And also for folks in the Q&A who are asking about ways to help getting involved if they're from the business community or have ties to the business community. That is an area that we don't always focus on when we're talking about asylum seekers, but you definitely have identified that one of those places of intersection where those interests can really align. Can you give us a little bit of a walkthrough of the examples that you saw on our trip to El Paso and Juarez of what states or localities are doing in El Paso or other examples?
Of course. So giving a little bit of a broad view before going on to specific examples. So both state and local governments are responding to the needs of migrants, but are focusing their efforts differently, albeit these efforts are really in a cumulative fashion. So localities, as I mentioned, are at the front line of the response and focus on the immediate needs of arriving migrants. State governments have the critical role of directing multi-sector responses. So as such, the efforts that they are undertaking can look different, but all this works towards the same goal of ensuring migrants have access to the tools they need to succeed once they arrive here. So I'll dive into El Paso as an example. So El Paso County has created within the last years a migrant services support center to aid migrants. The center works with newly arrived migrants and helps them coordinate transportation in collaboration with other city officials. The center really focuses on migrants who can self-pay for their travel to their intended destination in the US. And this really helps the center process a greater number of migrants and also helps to decompress other scarce resources such as shelters. And at the center, migrants are given resources such as a video to combat misinformation they may have heard in their travels, food, and a packet of toiletries from local humanitarian organizations. Intake, where staff help migrants figure out their final destination and how to get there. And they are also given some basic information about the documents that they obtain once they enter into the US. I will say that the primary goals of the Migrant Services Support Center are really to, one, empower and ensure humanitarian processes for newly arrived migrants in El Paso, and to also really help people move quickly to their final destination to decompress resources. And also, just to be clear, this operation is distinct from other migrant busing operations in the state of Texas, in that a lot of the transportation is coordinated within localities as well. I can give another example at the state level. So, for example, Massachusetts has recently hosted a work authorization clinic. So many states that have offices of new Americans have been at the forefront of this type of response. And the Massachusetts Office of for Refugees and Immigrants hosted a resource clinic in Reading, Massachusetts this past November. And really, while the goal of the clinic is to provide work authorization access to migrants that currently don't have it, the clinic also functions as a broad resource too. So the clinic also brought together organizations that can help connect asylum seekers with employment opportunities, legal service providers to help immigrants with immediate needs, and other organizations that could help conduct case management work as well. So bringing in partners that targeted multiple different needs really allowed the Massachusetts government to more effectively leverage the specialty that each partner brought. So for example, legal service providers were able to focus on helping migrants with their cases, while other organizations worked on connecting migrants to employment. Additionally, I will add that federal partners in the form of USCIS and DHS provided support to accept and process applications at these events. So providing migrants with work authorization and connecting them with employment opportunities, these are really examples of how states are focusing on both the immediate and long-term needs of migrants. I will also add that New York City was one of, I think, the first to use a model like this of hosting work authorization clinics. And since October, the state, in collaboration with local and federal partners, has helped us submit 5,500 work authorizations and TPS applications using these clinics. And if you are interested in learning more about this topic, I will add that one of my colleagues at the council recently wrote a blog post about this on the council's Immigration Impact website. And just to give a brief final example, so in Illinois, recently, Illinois Governor Pritzker announced funding to establish an intake center to provide services for newly arrived migrants and a base tent camp that will help house additional migrants. And the aim of these initiatives is really to provide a more humanitarian response to recently arrived migrants in the States, and particularly focusing on preventing migrants from being released in the street. This has come to focus more with winter approaching, and the governor also announced additional funding for wraparound services for migrants that focus on providing work authorization and legal access to migrants. I'll just close by saying that what these examples show is that state and local governments are really driving innovation on how to effectively welcome migrants to the US. And they're using novel approaches and ensuring that migrants, when they arrive here, actually have the tools to succeed.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Juan. And I know that there's a lot of questions coming up about sort of what can we do? How do we help? And that really points us to a lot of those answers, and really encourage, like Juan said, to go to our website. We have blog posts to access some of this information for a little bit of a deeper dive. We have things called Take Actions, which are links where you can direct your sort of demands or requests to Congress and DHS on some of these issues. And then we also have some pretty basic sort of materials of laying out from our brilliant research team, and also our policy and legal teams, of explaining in more in depth how these systems work. And so we are going to get to as many of your Q&As. Why do I keep calling them Q&As? It's because I look at the little block in my screen. As many of your questions as possible, and maybe we'll have answers. We hope so. But first, Dara, I'm going to turn it over to you to talk a little bit about how folks can support the council, and then we'll return to questions.
Sure. So as folks are probably well aware, it is the end of the year, and so, a great time to donate to your favorite nonprofit organizations. And if you appreciate the work that, we've just both the work of this webinar and the work that went in to support it, right? The fact-finding trips to the border, Adriel's work as advising individual migrants, the work of the state and local team. If you appreciate the fact that we're doing this while trying to keep a handle on what's going on in Congress and the White House and getting that information out to the public and sending, information out to our email list members about what's on the table and what they need to do to contact their members of Congress and make their voices heard. If you appreciate the fact that we have better awareness of where people are and what they're eligible for, thanks to our research team, or the work that the Center for Inclusion and Belonging at the Council has done with, getting everyone in the US to think about welcoming and belonging as American values, then you should absolutely use the QR code here. You can either scan it directly with your phone, or if you want to save it for later, you can take a screenshot at this time. And that will direct you to using the QR code will direct you to the webpage where you can donate, or you can also use the URL as displayed on your screen right now. We would really appreciate it. Definitely save it. And, if you're not comfortable making a commitment right now because you're busy waiting to hear how we answer your questions, then, that link will remain valid, certainly through the end of the year. So thank you very much for considering this and for attending the webinar.
Thank you, Dara. I appreciate it. And thank you everyone for all of your support and hanging in there with us. We are doing a series of webinars as well. So we are going to have some follow-up webinars with some different focuses. One of our follow-ups will be with those local service providers and some of the organizations that we worked with or met with on the ground in the border community. So please stay tuned and look out for that for folks who have questions about those organizations. We're going to have an entire panel hour dedicated to them. And we also are going to have some follow-ups again on sort of what we can do moving forward. So I know that there's a lot of requests for how do we organize around this? This is a pretty significant issue, as we all know. And we're going to have some deeper dives in the coming months in our series of webinars coming up. So turning over to some of your questions and answers, we are going to put a link. We have a link in our chat. So not the Q&A section, but in the chat of our Take Actions and our Immigration Justice Campaign page, which is a place where you can sign up to get notifications and requests to take action, to involve both at the state and local level and at the national level to advocate on some of these pressing issues. You can sign up for our email list there. And of course, if you're also on the council's email list, you can join those Take Actions from there as well. And we're putting a couple of other resources in the chat. Let's go to some questions. So there's sort of a bucket of questions, and I think it would be great, Adriel, if we could start with you. Where do you point communities and migrants and asylum seekers themselves once they're in the United States? Where do you point them in terms of getting resources? We know that the best thing to do is to get an immigration attorney. We also know that those resources are extremely limited. And so what do we tell people when they are, when communities are trying to help or direct folks to be able to sort of access information themselves?
Yeah, I mean, I think as some folks have noted in the question and answer box is that there's just either people feel like there's a dearth of information sometimes, and others, I think there's a lot of information, but people just don't know about it. And so I think one thing, if folks are interested, is really trying to find what are the nonprofits in your areas. So this is for folks who are interested in like helping migrants and share information, is just finding out migrants or migrant serving organizations in your areas. Many nonprofits tend to try to share those types of resources, at least specific to their localities. The American Immigration Council, we have like really in-depth fact sheets about the immigration system if people are interested in that kind of information. One thing I would say for like directly impacted folks, people who are seeking asylum, the Asylum Seeker the Asylum Seeker Advocacy Project, ASAP, actually is a really great resource for understanding things. They have like videos as well about what the asylum process looks like. So I would definitely head over to their website to try to get that information. But honestly, there are a lot of like national groups like the Immigrant Legal Resource Center, the National Immigration Justice Center in Chicago. A lot of organizations across the country do provide a lot of information generally about how the system works. And so I think it's just really trying to think about what's in your area to use that as a resource.
Yeah, and we're going to put some links in the chat as well. Some folks have requested that, and I will also point to a website that Las Americas, which is one of the service providers in El Paso and Juarez that we worked with, has, which is city specific and has a list of all sorts of different kinds of resources for these major cities. So we'll put a link to that in the chat as well. There's a question right now, or sort of a series of questions, and I'm going to turn to you, Dara. What can we say about these attempts to further limit asylum and access to asylum at the border? What does that look like right now, and what can we do to sort of head it off?
Sure. So for those who haven't been following, as the result of demands from House or from congressional Republicans to refuse to vote on any kind of supplemental funding package for military aid to Ukraine or other countries, as well as supplemental funding for the border, Republicans have refused to do this without substantive changes to immigration policy. And so there are currently negotiations happening that have been kind of stop and go, but are currently are currently underway, in which it seems that there's a lot of interest among both Hill Democrats and the White House in making pretty major concessions on this. The actual negotiations have been very, very opaque, and it's not clear that the people doing the negotiating really understand immigration policy. And so it's been kind of difficult for us to talk about publicly or for us to figure out what's going on. But we can say that some of the stuff on the table includes raising the bar for screenings to the standard that is to a reasonable fear standard, which means that someone with a 50% chance of having their asylum claim approved would still be denied the right to even go before an immigration judge and make that claim. We know that people are considering putting some sort of numerical cap on the number of people who could seek or receive asylum in a year, which is which would end up creating backlogs rather than preventing people, rather than kind of preventing people from entering. We know that there would be wide expansion. There could be wide expansion of detention and of expedited removal, which is the ability of the government to deport someone without a court hearing at all. And we know that there are discussions to kind of reanimate what Title 42 was used for and give the president the unilateral ability to refuse anyone entry into the United States, which, as we saw under Title 42, not only, could wreck legal immigration to the US, but also incentivizes people who are trying to enter from just avoiding Border Patrol agents, and ends up resulting in, humanitarian disasters as people are smuggled in pretty dire conditions and may or may not necessarily reduce border crossings. So everything on the table has very unclear relationship to what people say they want to do, which is to get fewer people to cross the border, but has very, very real harms. And so we're very concerned that this is going to result in a real damage to the US's ability to protect people from persecution and the due process rights of immigrants in the United States that is going to be given up without you know, without resolving any of the underlying problems.
Awesome, thank you. And Adriel, there's sort of the questions here about what it looks like. Should we be trying to encourage the government to move people or distribute people who cross the border throughout the country, or some sort of process of that we see this narrative, this concern of large numbers of people who've crossed coming to cities that aren't able to provide resources for them? What can you say about both that sort of narrative and what are some possible solutions?
Yeah, I mean, I think I think what's really important is to really think about how is it that we can really integrate folks into the communities and provide the support that they need, at least temporarily, as they're going through their immigration process. And I think it's it's hard to really think about. I mean, you can't really control everything, right? Like you can only provide information and really try to find like a coordinated response. But I think when we use language like flow of migrants or distribute immigrants, like you can't. It's like it's easy to imagine what you could potentially do if you were God and you could like move things with your hands. But things don't really work that way. And so, but I think like on the ground in reality, what we can do is thinking about how we can have a much more coordinated response between localities and the federal government. I think the federal government right now hasn't really been stepping up in a way that it should. And as the American Immigration Council, we really do think that, like Juan was saying, there are really great and wonderful things that localities are having to do. Right in this moment, they're finding opportunities in this difficult time. But I think without having a real strong role with the federal government to really try to think through how is it that migrants can get more information, especially if they don't have connections to the United States, about places that they could temporarily go. And I think that there's programs like sponsorship programs that could be established to help people integrate into communities that they might not otherwise think about. And so I think there's sort of that missing element of being able to do that. I know states like New York have like good programs where they're trying to get folks to understand where like the work opportunities. So they're working with their Department of Labor to like kind of do that kind of coordinated response. And I think that if you can do that at a larger scale, I think that would be a lot more helpful. And then the last point I will say is that, in some of my work, when I talk to local representatives, and we're talking to some folks in Indiana, like a trade association, as well as some representatives there, and they talk about how they have a labor shortage, but folks aren't really thinking about, at least you haven't seen it in the media, as Indiana being a large place, or a place that is receiving a large amount of migrants. And so I think if there was more of a coordinated response, then you could potentially be able to connect people to work opportunities and to communities that does sort of spread the love a little bit as well.
Thanks, Adriel. There are sort of a series of questions, and Dara, I think I might let you have the last word here. There are a number of questions about this narrative, and then the reality of an increased number of people who are coming to the United States and migrating here, and how do we first address the narrative that on the one hand people are saying, well, we've got open borders, we're just people are running willy-nilly, and then on the other hand sort of addressing to what Adriel was talking about in terms of how we communicate about people and the consequences of those narratives. So sort of connecting that there is an increased number of folks coming, right? And what are our policy asks, and how do we talk about it?
So I will say that I think a lot of people who are really interested in taking action focus a lot on like the message that they're trying to send, and less so, and in a way that like can really stop us from being that can stop people from being as helpful as we can, right? That like the you know, the importance of talking about the kind of reality of, yes, there are more people coming, and you know, there's a real difference because many of them don't have support networks in the United States. There are a lot of housing shortages in major US cities. There are obstacles to them being able to support themselves. And so, of course, it's not surprising that cities are finding themselves in a crunch. Of course, it's not surprising that a federal government that has never really invested in processing migrants now finds itself, you know, feeling that there are too many people coming through for it to process because it hasn't invested in processing those. Those are, you know, those are things that it's really important to acknowledge because they're true. And because that's the only way we have to acknowledge the problems before we can try to fix any of them. The, you know, dynamic in which the restrictionists are saying that that there are simply too many people coming in, and there aren't people who are really motivated to talk about, yeah, there are problems here, means that that space gets ceded to them. And so I would just say that, like, it's really important to stay engaged and try to be informed on this stuff. It's all very confusing, and it's often not, you know, it's either not reported or it's reported not in a nuanced way. But if you can be the person in your circles who is staying informed and who is telling other people what the reality is, then you're increasing the awareness of A, where you can plug in as an individual, and B, what sort of fixes would be needed that Congress can take, that, you know, that local governments can take. And so it's just, and you know, that gets to what that Adriel was saying in terms of like helping people themselves. Not everyone is in regular contact with asylum seekers, but you know, people who are will themselves be hearing about stuff from other people. Any to the extent that everyone is better informed about the realities of the process, that it is very hard to get asylum in the United States, that there are these restrictions, that there is this period of time in which people, you know, will be waiting and unable to work legally. If people in general understand that better, by definition, the people who are affected are going to end up, you know, hearing the right message more often. And so I think it's just really important in general to not allow immigration policy to be something that only immigrants themselves understand. But in part, that's because if we want immigrants to better understand things, everyone else needs to understand it better too.
Great way to end it. Again, for some resources, we are having a series of webinars, so you can find out about those the same way you found out about this one. Also, make sure that you're on the council's email list, the Immigration Justice Campaign, which is our advocacy arms email list. All of that information, again, is in the chat. You will be able to have access to this, the recording of this webinar. And we have virtual doors that are open. So please reach out. I know there was a lot of really interesting questions that we couldn't get to in the Q&A. We continue to do our work on sort of reporting these findings. We are going to be issuing special reports and other kinds of materials related to this border work to try to sort of keep up the pressure on our government for solutions that address all of these really important issues that that we've raised today. So I want to thank our panelists, Adriel, Juan, and Dara. Thank you so much. Thank you, Kel and Andrea, the folks behind the scenes making all the things work. And we will see you next time.